Hey, this is Will, and in this lesson, we're going to be talking about kubeconfigs, and we'll answer the question, what are kubeconfigs and why do we need them? A kubeconfig is just a Kubernetes configuration file, and this is a file that stores information about clusters, users, namespaces, and authentication mechanisms. Essentially, a kubeconfig file is a file that contains the configuration data that we need in order to connect to and interact with one or more Kubernetes clusters. So if I want to connect to a Kubernetes cluster, I need to know where the cluster is located, what user I'm going to use to authenticate, as well as any other additional information like client certificates that I need in order to successfully authenticate. And a kubeconfig file contains all that information. You can find more information about kubeconfigs in the official Kubernetes documentation. There's a link there, and you can also find that link in the description below this video. So here's a list of the kind of information that kubeconfigs can contain. It will tell us where our cluster is located. It will tell us what user we want to use, as well as our tokens or client certificates that we're going to use to authenticate. And you can even define multiple contexts in a kubeconfig file. So a kubeconfig file can actually contain multiple sets of all this data, allowing you to easily switch between different configurations. For example, if you manage multiple Kubernetes clusters, you can change your context in order to communicate with the other cluster. But we're not going to be doing multiple clusters in this course. We're just going to be using kubeconfigs to store configuration data that will allow the many components of our Kubernetes cluster to connect to and interact with the cluster itself. So how are all these different parts and pieces of Kubernetes going to wire together? How are our multiple Kubernetes servers going to come together and communicate with each other? We're going to use kubeconfigs to manage all that configuration. So for example, how will the kubelet service on one of our worker nodes know how to locate the Kubernetes API and authenticate with it? It's going to use a kubeconfig. There's going to be a kubeconfig file that will contain that information that we will put on the worker node. So in the next lesson, we are going to actually go ahead and generate the kubeconfig files that our cluster is going to need.